That's probably the right word. It's like a complete not polite English expression. We're going to be starting by looking at how the dactylic hexameter was done as the basic, the central, possibly the most straightforward of the Latin meters to write. Not that any of them, of course, are exactly straightforward, but equally it's, to use an over-familiar phrase, it really is not rocket science. It's something that was done as an absolutely standard school exercise by hundreds of thousands of European and American school children over many centuries. So once you get the knack of it, it remains challenging, but it's by no means impossible. The key thing to remember, I think, is that the caesura is at the heart of the hexameter. I strongly suggest you aim for a straightforward, strong caesura in the third foot. By a strong caesura, we mean one after the first long syllable of the foot. A so-called weak caesura would be, if you have a dactyl, it would be between the two shorts of a dactyl. That counts as weak. And from time to time, you will see a weak caesura in the third foot, almost always combined with a strong one in the fourth foot. That's a very common combination if that's the third foot and that's the fourth foot. Weak caesura there, strong caesura in the fourth foot to go with it. Because the weak caesura on its own just is a bit too weak, falling between the two shorts of a dactyl. Anyway, that's not something I'm particularly suggesting you imitate, but you do see that in Roman poets. But what we really want most of the time is a strong caesura in the third foot. And that divides the hexameter into two unequal parts. And it's these two unequal parts that we're absolutely looking at constantly. What you're writing more often is half lines rather than whole lines. And you're looking to, particularly to start at the end and work back towards the caesura, or from time to time, start at the beginning, working forwards towards it. Either way, what you're writing is half a line, and so if it's the first half, it contains 2.5 feet, or if it's the second half, it contains 3.5 feet. And these half-line units, hemistichs being the ancient word, these half-line units are what we're constantly aiming at. The most challenging part of writing a hexameter is probably doing the end, because we're ending, if we're doing standard lines, which I recommend we do to start with, we're ending with a dactyl and a spondee. Bear in mind that the last syllable of every line of classical verse is ambiguous. It doesn't matter whether it's long or short. So when we say we've got a spondee at the end, what we mean is either a spondee or a trochee. Our fifth foot really must be a dactyl if we're writing standard lines. Of course, as you know, fifth foot spondees are not illegal and indeed should be used from time to time for emphasis, for some effect. But if we're just writing standard lines, let's not do any of that. Let's leave that to sort of clever chaps like Virgil. And looking at the line as two halves, cut in half by the main caesura, and bearing in mind that in the hexameter, those halves are not equal. In a pentameter, of course, they are equal, and the difference is that the second half must consist of two dactyls and a single syllable, whereas in the first half of the pentameter you get the choice of dactyl or spondee, as you do in the first 4 feet of the hexameter. So foot 5 and foot 6 are pretty rigid. The first 4 feet, of course, are open to being either dactyls or spondees, and it's up to you as the poet to choose what arrangement you want. If you're writing several lines of continuous hexameters, you want a bit of variety in that, rather than the same scheme all the time. It's worth thinking about variety there. The other place where it's worth thinking about variety, I think, is towards the end of the line. If you want to be doing it right, which we do want you to be doing, you need to be ending with either a 2 or 3 syllable word. So 2 syllable word like that, or a 3 syllable word including the end of the fifth foot like that. Those are really the only two permissible options for ending the line, unless you want to do something odd. And I suggest you don't do anything odd, at least to begin with. We can work up to doing odd things later on for literary effect. But if you're doing a basic, straightforward, correct and elegant line, you want to be ending with a 2 or 3 syllable word, and so you've got to think about what words will go there, and the next thing to think about is what words will go before them, of course, to make your fifth foot dactyl. So those are perhaps the chief challenges in producing a hexameter that's going to work. Once you've worked that out, then, well, work back from the end towards the caesura. In other words, do your 3.5 feet. Once you've got the end sorted out, you can fill in the gap back to the caesura. You can also maybe start at the other end, think about what you want at the beginning of the line, and then work forward towards the caesura from the beginning, making your 2.5 feet there. SVOR, which stands for subject, verb, object, and rubbish. By rubbish, I mean everything else at all that you can possibly wish to put in a line of verse, but most obviously adjectives and adverbs, things that have that very helpful capacity of filling space, and wonderful words like nunc and yam and so on that provide fillers for monosyllabic gaps. I mean, unless one of these other words happens to be key to what you're saying. I mean, if the most important word in your sentence is, say, the adverb, what really matters is how something is done, well, fine, then the adverb is the key word and you choose very carefully where you put that. But in general, you're writing a straightforward sentence, simple sentence, got a subject, got a main verb, it's got an object. Those are the key things. Find the right place in the line for the key things. So I was talking earlier about the sedes or seat for things, that being the usual term certainly used by Renaissance poets and writers on metrics. Find the right seat, the right position for the keywords, and try not to leave very unpleasant gaps to be filled in. Try and get gaps that you can easily find, say, adjectives or other words to fill. If you do have a monosyllabic gap, well, it's not the end of the world. You're allowed to use the word nunc, I think, once or twice. Best not to do that all the time, but yeah, from time to time. Yes, of course, we have a monosyllabic gap and it's fillable. But ideally, maybe you might have a couple of, obviously, words of 2 or 3 syllables at the end, a word that obviously fills up the fifth foot, maybe goes farther back into the fourth foot at the end. Then you've left yourself a gap between the fifth foot and the caesura of maybe the equivalent of 3 long syllables, either 3 or 2 most often, and that's the sort of thing that you start putting your adjectives or other less important words into.